This is an analysis from Alpha Business Media. When we think about international trade, we usually picture goods crossing a border and maybe a simple tax being paid. But what if the biggest obstacle, the real wall, isn't a tax at all? What if it's something far more unpredictable? Today, we are unpacking the hidden world of non-tariff barriers and what they really mean for the critical trade relationship between Nepal and India. To really get this, let's put ourselves in someone's shoes. Imagine you are a ginger farmer in Nepal. You have poured your entire year into your crop. Your truck is loaded and it's headed for the massive Indian market. But then, at the border, everything grinds to a halt. Your whole livelihood is on the line, not because of a tax you could have planned for, but because of a sudden, out-of-the-blue demand for a new kind of test. And right there, that single moment, that captures the entire problem. The barrier isn't a wall of money, it's a wall of complete uncertainty. So what do we call this? Well, the official term is a non-tariff barrier, or NTB for short. Think of it like this. A tariff is like a predictable toll you pay on a highway. You know it's there, you can budget for it. An NTB, on the other hand, is like that same highway being shut down without any warning for a vague inspection that could last for days. They're often disguised as legitimate health and safety rules, but it's their sheer unpredictability that makes them so incredibly damaging. Okay, so for our first section, let's look at the invisible wall and explore how this has become the single biggest threat to Nepal's exports. You see, on paper, you have agreements like the South Asian Free Trade Area, which are all about promising open and easy commerce. But the reality on the ground? It's a whole different story. That border often acts less like a gateway and more like a strategic choke point, where the flow of goods can be choked off at any moment by these invisible barriers. That brings us to our second section, a system, not an error. Because the analysis we're looking at argues that these barriers aren't just random mistakes. They're part of a deliberate system of what's called de facto protectionism. And at the core tactic here is something the analysis calls weaponized ambiguity. This is the intentional use of rules that are vague, that are subjective, and most importantly, that are applied inconsistently. It's an incredibly powerful tool because it injects the maximum possible uncertainty into the process, which makes it just about impossible for an exporter to plan or build a reliable business. So let's go back to our ginger farmer for a second. That demand for a complex pesticide test, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It tends to pop up suddenly, and this is the critical part, just as India's own domestic ginger harvest is about to hit the market. By the time the Nepali farmer can even get the required test done, that market window has slammed shut. The timing is absolutely everything. And it is not just ginger. Let's take large cardamom, one of Nepal's most valuable exports. A whole shipment can get rejected based on really subjective things like moisture content or the amount of foreign matter. And because these aren't precise, globally agreed upon numbers, it gives an official at the border enormous discretion to just say, no. This is where it gets absolutely devastating, especially for perishable goods like tomatoes. In this case, the weapon is a quarantine alert. A sudden warning about a pest, say a fruit fly, can halt all imports for inspection. But here's the thing. For a truck full of fresh tomatoes, the delay is the penalty. They can't survive days sitting in the heat. The entire shipment is lost, and not a single tariff was ever paid. So the crucial point to take away from all this is that these are not isolated failures or bureaucratic mix-ups. The analysis makes it clear that the inconsistency is the point. It's a feature, not a bug, of the system. It's designed to inject so much risk into the equation that it systematically dismantles the competitiveness of Nepali agriculture. All right, Section 3, the MRA missing link. Now, a common reaction to all this might be, well, Nepal just needs to build better testing labs, right? But as the analysis shows, that solution completely misses the real problem, a critical missing piece of diplomatic infrastructure. The real issue isn't about the lab equipment. It's about recognition. The actual solution is something called a Mutual Recognition Agreement, or an MRA. This is a formal, high-level political deal where both countries agree to trust each other's lab results. So if a product is certified as safe in Nepal, India would be obligated to accept that certification. But for agriculture, a comprehensive agreement like this simply doesn't exist between the two countries. This comparison really lays out the power imbalance at the border perfectly. On one side, a Nepali exporter shows up with a certificate from their own government's food quality lab. But because there's no MRA, the Indian official isn't required to accept it. They have the legal right to demand a retest in an Indian-accredited lab. And that kicks off a new cycle of crippling delays and extra costs. The result? the Nepali certificate becomes essentially powerless right at the moment it matters most. So that's how it works. But the big question is why? Why does this system persist? For that, we turn to Section 4, the onion principle, which looks at the political economy of perishable goods. The analysis calls this the onion principle. In a country like India, the domestic price of staple foods, think onions, tomatoes, potatoes, is incredibly politically sensitive. A sudden price spike can lead to public anger and protests, but a price crash from too many imports can ruin local farmers. This creates enormous political pressure on the government to protect its own producers, especially during their harvest seasons. And this is what makes non-tariff barriers the perfect political tool. Think about it. They're fast, you can deploy them instantly, they're incredibly effective, they stop imports dead in their tracks, and crucially, they are deniable. The official reason is always public health or food safety, never "we're protecting our farmers." And it all happens in a legal gray area of global trade rules. So, given this very complex reality, what is the path forward for Nepal? This brings us to our final section, the diversification imperative. The analysis concludes that what's needed is a fundamental strategic shift. This chart tells a pretty stark story. With roughly 2/3 of its total trade tied to a single partner, Nepal is in a position of extreme strategic vulnerability. This level of dependence just magnifies the impact of every single one of these trade disruptions at the border. So what happens if things just stay the same? The source calls this the inertial path. If Nepal just continues to react to each crisis as it comes, the constant uncertainty, the lost shipments, and the squeezed profits will just slowly chip away at its entire agricultural export economy. And this leads to a very hard truth. An export strategy that relies this heavily on one market, especially one where market access can be turned on and off for domestic political reasons, well, that's not really a strategy at all. It's a chronic economic liability. The only logical conclusion, then, is that the ultimate strategy for managing this risk is aggressive market diversification. And let's be clear, this isn't about being anti-India. It's about being pro-Nepal. It's about strategically redirecting energy and investment towards markets, maybe in the Middle East or Southeast Asia or Europe, where trade rules, even if they're strict, are at least stable, transparent, and predictable. And this leaves us with a final powerful conclusion from the analysis. In a world of these invisible walls and weaponized ambiguity, stability becomes the most valuable commodity of all. The strategic question for Nepal, then, is no longer whether its businesses can afford the cost of diversification, but whether they can truly afford not to.